Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the maritime tensions in the South China Sea. This is obviously a very hot geopolitical topic, and it's potentially a flaring point for conflict in the future. Let's hope not, but it's certainly a tense situation there. This is the cover of Time magazine this week, and if you can't see that clearly, basically it reads, "This is Nanshan Island. It is just 0.05 square kilometers. It is claimed by four governments and it is one of dozens of disputed isles and reefs at the heart of a 21st century power struggle. Welcome to the South China Sea." And the journalist there is Hannah Beach. That's the picture again. You can see it's pretty much nothing. Now, obviously, Time is an American magazine, so there will be some degree of bias with this. That goes without saying. But this is an interesting photograph of one of the disputed reefs in the area, Fiery Cross Reef. This is the first photograph is 2014. Second photograph, 2016. That's 2 years. You can see a difference. And the report said 2 years ago, this disputed reef in the South China Sea was little more than a couple of rocks and a tiny weather station. Then China dug in. Now it has a running track, basketball courts, and a runway that can handle military jets. Um, it is quite clear that China, or more to the point, the Communist Party is determined to make its presence felt in this region. Um, and I've just watched a speech by Hua Chunying, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman. She's become something of a face of Chinese foreign policy in recent years. She seems to be one of the one of the most prominent, or at least one of the most visible Communist Party officials, other than Xi Jinping himself. And she basically said that China has no interest in carrying out a Cold War situation or a Hollywood style blockbuster as dreamt up by some military figures on the US side. So she's sort of taking the defensive stance of this is Uncle Sam attacking China. The thing is, it's difficult to have a lot of sympathy for the Chinese argument because they're not doing a great deal to kind of persuade the world that they are the good guys in all of this. Sorry to talk in those sort of terms. Of course, there's no good guys and bad guys. Geopolitics is rarely that simple. But the behavior of Beijing over the past 3 years regarding territory in the region hasn't exactly been humble, hasn't exactly been pacifist. This expansionism program has basically involved literally building islands, filling in cement, putting on landing runways, um, and stationing military personnel there. Those basketball courts are not for fun, they're for exercise for military personnel. Not long ago, they had some young women to kind of glamorize the area, and it's part of a pretty clever plot, or pretty clever plot might be the wrong word, but a very clever PR stunt, in my opinion, that Beijing is trying to put forward. Because China is a very powerful country, and they know that the West and the rest of Asia has mixed feelings about the rise of China. On one hand, it's good news um, for mutual trade and so on, and bilateral relations. There can be some common ground. On the other hand, it obviously causes natural anxiety because that's the nature of geopolitics. When a country gets more powerful, it causes concern. Now, the Chinese position is obviously under the Xi administration. It has been based on very much promoting a nationalist agenda, and this is partly to kind of reclaim Chinese honor. The Chinese still have something of a chip on their shoulder from the days of the Opium Wars and what was basically a humiliating late 19th century and early 20th century. the Chinese 20th century was a bit like the Russian 20th century. It was tragic, it was tumultuous, and it was marked by extreme political turmoil. Now China is relatively politically stable. It's a growing economy, although it has slowed down in the last year. But basically, Xi Jinping and his inner circle know that communism as a brand has more or less failed. They know that we are living in the 21st century and this is a failed ideology. So, to distract the domestic audience from grievances such as corruption and other areas, they focus on nationalism. Nationalism is a very, very powerful drug, and not just in China, across the world. Donald Trump is doing the same thing in America, and Donald Trump is even more bombastic about it, far more bombastic than Xi Jinping. Nationalism is a powerful drug. It's a heroine of mass hysteria, to put it that way. Um, now, for me, when I make videos about China, I always feel slightly. I want to make them because I'm very, I feel very candid about what I'm saying, but it's always slightly awkward because I am not a xenophobe. I am not anti-China. Most of my friends, or at least over half of my friends, are Chinese. I've been connected to the Chinese community for quite a while. Certainly, I wouldn't like open up a conversation with them on this subject. It's not something I would particularly want to talk about. But the reason I want to express my views in a video like this is because there has to be a counter narrative to the phony arguments that the CCP is putting out there. Um, I mean, they have to understand that you cannot present yourself as innocent if you are actively militarizing the area. And China really isn't doing a great deal to make friends in the region. Forget America for a second. Let's just imagine America was out of the equation. I know it's not, but let's just imagine it was. Um, China isn't exactly going out of its way to smooth over relations with Vietnam or the Philippines or Japan or other neighboring countries. And the side effect of this, it's kind of obvious, but the side effect is that there will be alliances which historically would seem out of place. So you'd have the Philippines and Japan, which are not exactly historic allies, which is an understatement. But, China's always tried to portray Japan as the bad guys because of wartime history. But China is running the risk of becoming the bad guy in the region because they're behaving like a bully. They're basically, I mean, do they really think that anyone is going to buy the propaganda that this is for peaceful purposes? For what it's worth, I don't actually believe China wants a war because the one of their main priorities is domestic stability, um, and it's not as if China can afford a war right now. Their economy is in decline from say 5 years ago, so it can't exactly afford a war. I don't actually think Xi Jinping wants a war, but what China does want to do is flex its muscles. This is partly understandable. It's the nature of powerful countries. Every powerful country does it. So I'm not saying China's in any way unique in this regard. I just think that the arguments that they're putting out are just nonsensical. And if they expect anyone to believe this, they're deluded. I mean, saying things like we have lighthouses for ships and oh, this is just a tourist island, and it's a complete propaganda campaign to try and make this whole militarization of the region look innocent and defensive. But what China's behavior is not de-escalating tensions; it's escalating tensions. And what Miss Hu is saying is it just contradicts the reality of what is happening. Because if China is really interested in de-escalating this, they wouldn't be, militarizing these reefs and these islands. Well, what is the point other than to flex muscles and basically loom over smaller countries like Vietnam and the Philippines and say, we are the regional superpower, don't mess with us. That's what they're basically saying. So they are behaving as the regional bully. That's irrefutable. Now, the Chinese argument will be smaller countries are stooges of America. But what they're doing is pushing these smaller countries to be stooges of America, to put it a rather crude way. If China doesn't want its neighboring countries to get into the American sphere, then they have to stop acting like the regional bully. And that means dialogue, it means not expanding its territory, which is basically what it's doing. And I don't buy this argument that, oh, we're reclaiming historic Chinese. That's a stupid argument. It's, I mean, that contradicts what she is saying about 21st century mentality. You cannot argue that you're looking at 21st century mentality when you're basically justifying expansionism by saying, oh, this was historically Chinese waters. That's stupid because then many other countries around the world could claim exactly the same thing, and it would lead to constant expansionist situations and never ending conflict. It's a completely phony argument, and in my opinion, it's a void argument in the 21st century, reclaiming historic boundaries. Unless it directly impacts Chinese citizens' lives, it's a phony argument. That's the other thing about this area that perplexes me. We're not talking about inhabited islands. We're talking about rocklets. I mean, you could sort of understand where tensions would arise from, and in this area, I'm also quasi criticizing Vietnam and the Philippines and other neighboring countries. The governments of all these countries need to see the bigger picture and really, really consider this. Are a group of islands, uninhabited islands, really worth potential war? It's a crazy thought. Of course, you'd have to be a bit naive to think that it is just about these rockets. I suspect there might be something else going on here. There's fishing deposits. There might well be oil resources. Who knows? So it might be more than meets the eye. But all I would say is China's not getting a great deal of international sympathy. And of course, Communist Party networks like Xinhua is going to toe their line because that's the thing about China is it has no independent media. So there's no Chinese media to scrutinize their own government's position. It's ultranationalism, which is a bit like what you get with Russia today. Um, the contrast is that in countries like the United States, you get critical media. I mean, I don't like Fox News, but the point is it scrutinizes the Obama administration. Now, no Chinese network can say it does the same thing to the Chinese government. Hence, there is no scrutiny, hence, no transparency. And it's quite clear that what is going on is that Xi Jinping is using nationalism as a new kind of distraction for the Chinese people. And it's working to some extent because there is a sort of army of online cyber Chinese nationalists who get extremely defensive, who are ultra sensitive, and who will harass and try to shout down anyone who has a different point of view. And all of this behavior is not winning much sympathy for the Chinese argument. If you want to really make the case that China is simply defending its territory and it's not interested in escalating tension, then start acting on it. Start providing evidence for that. Because at the moment, the Chinese approach has been nothing but escalation. Um, I mean, I'm not going to say America's entirely innocent. You know, every powerful country plays games, and I have no doubt that America wants to exert its influence in the region just as much as China does. That's politics. And there's certainly things America could probably do to de escalate tensions as well. I think, for example, joint military drills, maybe with the Philippines, at this particular time is not that helpful. Um, so there may be areas America can also kind of be more pragmatic. But China needs to understand that it's a powerful country. They may get away with crushing dissent on Chinese soil, but the rest of the world isn't going to tolerate their bullying outside. And I'm not even talking about China here, I'm talking about the Communist Party. It's not the same thing. I know that they like to think it is, but yeah, all I'm saying is it's difficult for outsiders to be very sympathetic to China when China continues to behave in this aggressive way. And you cannot argue that you're all about peace and you want to de-escalate the situation if you're actively militarizing islands that were previously basically rocklets and reefs. I mean, what's that all about? And some of the arguments are just phony. I mean, oh, we're building lighthouses here for to help shipping, and we're developing this as a tourist resort. No one's going to buy that. The only people that are going to buy into that are people that are brainwashed by Chinese media, and even most Chinese people nowadays are not that gullible. So, I'm not saying the Chinese argument was 100% wrong. I'm not saying they have no case. I am saying that if they want to be arrogant and say, we don't care what the rest of the world thinks, we're just going to do what we want, go ahead. It will backfire. Because historically speaking, when a country has isolated itself, they lose. This is a historic fact, and you can see it throughout history. By contrast, if a country gets into a collaboration with other countries, for right or wrong, then they end up on the right side of history because they win the argument. It may be right, it may be wrong, but that is what happens. So China, from my perspective, is doing very, very little to make friends in the region right now, and that's a great pity because China needs friends in the region. In fact, I want China to have friends because I want a stable world. I don't want China to be in a state of war. I love China. I don't want it to be in a state of war. I don't even want a weak China. It's not about that. But I am tired of the arrogance that comes from the CCP, and that is blatantly obvious with every statement they make. It's based on ultranationalism, it's based on defensiveness. Okay, America can be arrogant as well, there's no question about that. But America at least isn't expanding in the region. America isn't building islands thousands of miles from its coast and saying this belongs to us. It's China that's doing that. So, you know, those are the facts. And I really hope this doesn't escalate. But I think all the governments in the region have responsibility. All the governments do. But certainly, when I speak to friends in the Philippines or Vietnam, they've nothing against the Chinese people, but they have contempt for what the Chinese government is doing, and that's my perspective of what is happening. I'm looking at the Chinese arguments, and I just don't see them carrying a lot of weight. Most of the arguments tend to be about, oh well, we used to own this land anyway, so everyone else should shut up, or the West doesn't like China becoming powerful, and these are just basically flimsy arguments, and the whole basis is about muscle flexing. And if that is your argument, then it's starts to wear thin because you end up looking like the bad guy. Perception is everything.